حسناً، مرحباً بكم في إصدار برو 4. هذا هو أذكى نظام ذكاء اصطناعي في العالم، وسنوضح لكم كيف ولماذا. من المذهل حقاً رؤية هذا التقدم في مجال الذكاء الاصطناعي. انظروا إلى هذا النقش على الجدران الداخلية لمعبد حتذور في دندرة، مصر. هناك نقش بارز ظل علماء المصريات يحاولون تفسيره لمدة 60 عاماً. يبدو وكأنه مصباح كهربائي، ليس تقريباً.
Did the ancient Egyptians have electricity? Today we're going to look at where this image actually comes from, what's carved around it that almost nobody mentions, and why Egyptologists have a very different and very well documented answer for what it depicts. The relief sits inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, in Upper Egypt, about 60 kilometers north of Luxor. The temple as it stands today was built during the Ptolemaic period, the centuries after Alexander the Great's conquest, when Greek-descended pharaohs ruled Egypt, with the site dated to around the 1st century BCE. It's one of the best preserved temple complexes in the country. You can still see painted ceilings, an intact crypt system, and a rooftop chapel dedicated to Osiris. Like most Egyptian temples, though, the surface structure sits on top of a much older sacred site. Dendera had been a place of worship for over 2,000 years before the current building was finished, and its priesthood explicitly saw themselves as continuing a much older religious tradition, which is part of why so much of the temple's imagery draws on symbolism far predating its actual construction date. The reliefs in question are carved into the walls of the temple's crypts, small, restricted underground chambers where cult objects and ritual equipment were stored, accessible only to priests rather than the general public. That restricted setting is part of why the imagery down there tends to be denser and more specialized than what's carved on the temple's public-facing walls. It's also, understandably, part of why the secret knowledge reading of the carving has had such staying power. A hidden chamber with an unusual image is exactly the kind of setting a mystery likes to live in. The idea that this relief depicts an electrical device isn't ancient. It's a 20th century interpretation. It was first proposed in the 1950s by a Norwegian electrical engineer, and it reached a wide audience decades later through the work of two Austrian writers, Peter Krasse and Reinhard Habeck, who argued in a book that the Dendera reliefs depicted a functioning ancient lamp. An Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Garn went further and actually built a physical replica based on the relief's proportions, filling a bulb-shaped glass vessel with a rarefied gas and running current through a coiled element to see whether it would produce a glow resembling the image. It's a good story precisely because it has real names, a real book, and a real experiment attached to it. That's part of why it has outlasted so many other fringe archaeology claims. But building a working lamp that resembles a carving doesn't tell you what the carving was made to represent. It only tells you that the shape is compatible with a lamp, which is a much weaker claim than it sounds. The theory's popularity also owes a lot to Erich von Däniken, whose ancient astronaut writing in the 1960s and 70s helped push Dendera into mainstream pop culture and to the sheer visual punch of the image itself. Once someone points out that the shape reads as a glass bulb with a socket, it's genuinely hard to look at it any other way. That's a real feature of the carving. It's just not evidence about its meaning by itself. Here's the detail that gets left out of almost every viral version of this story. The bulb isn't a standalone image. It's one panel in a larger, recurring scene, and Egyptologists have cataloged several versions of it across the crypt walls at both Dendera and the neighboring Temple of Edfu, with consistent iconographic elements repeating across each one. The scene shows an elongated oval or bubble shape, inside which a serpent's body extends. Egyptologists identify that oval as a lotus flower, sometimes read together with the imagery of a jet pillar, a stylized column with crossbars near the top that is one of the most common and well-understood symbols in Egyptian religious art, generally standing for stability and the backbone of the god Osiris. In several versions of the scene, human or divine figures kneel beneath the oval shape, appear in support or present it, and a baboon holding knives appears nearby in at least one rendering, a detail that has no obvious place in an electrical device reading at all, but fits comfortably into an established set of protective and ritual figures found elsewhere in Egyptian temple art. The serpent itself has a name and a well-documented mythological role. It represents Horus Matoi, an aspect of Horus meaning roughly Horus who unites the two lands, closely associated with Hathor and worshipped at both Dendera and Edfu, since at least the late period, centuries before the Ptolemaic reliefs were carved. In the wider iconographic record, This god appears in several forms, as a child, as a falcon, as a sphinx, and, in these particular crypt reliefs, as a serpent emerging from a lotus flower. This is a part of the story that changes everything, and it's the part almost never mentioned in viral retellings. The reliefs come with their own built-in explanation. The Dendera and Edfu crypt scenes are accompanied by hieroglyphic inscriptions that have been translated and published, most thoroughly by the German Egyptologist Wolfgang Waitges, whose work specifically addressed a set of 6 related reliefs. The inscriptions frame the scene as an allegory of sunrise. Horus Matoi, in serpent form, is shown emerging from the underworld each morning to cross the sky, borne out a lotus flower that sits inside the protective belly of Nut, the sky goddess who is believed to swallow the sun each evening and give birth to it again at dawn. The oval shape has its own Egyptian name in the text, roughly container or chest, which lines up with the visual idea of an enclosing form rather than a sealed glass envelope. In the fuller scene, the same god is shown a few steps later standing on the prow of a solar bark, the boat that carries the sun across the sky in Egyptian cosmology, which only makes sense if the earlier image is part of the same daily solar cycle, rather than a piece of standalone machinery. That a genuinely elegant, internally consistent piece of religious storytelling, the sun being born from a flower inside the sky every single morning, and it isn't a reading Egyptologists invented after the fact to explain away an inconvenient image. It's built from a symbolic vocabulary, the lotus as an emergence point, the serpent as a solar cycle deity, the jet pillar as stability, Nut swallowing and rebirthing the sun. That shows up constantly across Egyptian temple art in contexts that have nothing to do with the specific carving and were never in dispute. None of this means a visual resemblance to a light bulb is fake or exaggerated. The proportions really do look like a bulb and filament to modern eyes, and it's worth taking seriously why that keeps happening rather than just dismissing it. Part of the answer is that long enclosing shape with something curving inside it is a fairly simple geometric arrangement, and it shows up in more than one unrelated tradition for more than one unrelated reason. A coiled snake inside an oval is not, on its own, a rare or technically demanding shape to carve. The stronger reason, though, is a selection effect. People searching for signs of ancient advanced technology tend to isolate the single most bulb-like panel out of a larger set of reliefs, strip away the kneeling figures, the baboon, the jet pillar, and the boat scene that follows it, and present the isolated oval next to a photograph of a real light bulb. Once you put the whole sequence back together, the birth from a flower imagery, the sky goddess symbolism, the boat carrying the same god across the sky moments later, and inscriptions that spell out a sunrise myth in explicit terms, it looks like a light bulb. Reading has to explain away a lot more than one oval shape. It has to explain why a genuinely functioning ancient lamp would be carved directly next to a baboon holding knives, a kneeling human figure, and a solar bark, none of which fit an electrical device story, and all which fit the religious one without any strain at all. There's also a scale problem that rarely comes up. If the ancient Egyptians actually possessed working electric lighting sophisticated enough to carve in careful technical detail, we'd expect to find supporting evidence elsewhere: wiring, insulated material, power sources capable of running a discharge tube, workshops, spare parts, or even just other unambiguous depictions of the same device used in ordinary daily life, rather than confined to one restricted set of crypt reliefs at 2 temples. None of that exists. What we do have is one real ancient electrical artifact, worth mentioning honestly: the so-called Baghdad battery, a sealed clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, found in Iraq and dated to roughly the Parthian or Sassanid period. Replicas filled with an acidic liquid do produce a small voltage, and some researchers have proposed it may have been used for electroplating. But it's a separate artifact, from a different region and different era, and its own purpose is still debated among specialists. It doesn't connect to Dendera, except in the loose sense that both get cited in the same online arguments. One detail that regularly gets attached to the Dendera story is the claim that deep interior chambers and tomb corridors in Egypt show no soot on their ceilings, which is presented as evidence that oil lamps and torches couldn't have been the light source used to paint and carve them. It's true that soot residue is inconsistent across different sites, and Egyptologists have studied this directly. The generally accepted explanation isn't exotic. Workers use simple oil lamps with wicks made of twisted cloth soaked in salt water or natron, a preparation that's well documented to significantly reduce smoke and soot output compared to an ordinary open flame, and chemical residue studies on some tomb walls have identified salt deposits consistent with exactly this technique. Reflected sunlight via polished copper mirrors was also used in some areas closer to entrances, and ventilation shafts have been identified in a number of tomb complexes. None of this requires proposing a missing high-technology explanation. It's a straightforward, well-attested piece of ancient craft knowledge that simply doesn't get mentioned as often as the soot-free ceilings themselves do. It's worth asking why. Out of thousands of strange-looking reliefs carved across Egypt, this one became the poster image for an entire genre of ancient technology content. Part of it is timing. The claim entered popular culture at exactly the moment ancient astronaut and lost civilization writing was becoming a commercial genre in its own right, riding the wave that Eric von Daniken's 1968 book on supposed extraterrestrial influence on ancient cultures had already created. A carving that looked like a modern invention was tailor-made for that audience, and it got picked up, repeated, and simplified with each retelling until a version most people encounter today is a single cropped photo with no context at all. Part of it is also just how television and later internet content tends to compress information. A documentary segment or a video essay has 30 seconds to make its point, and here's a carving that looks exactly like a light bulb is a much stronger 30 seconds than here's a carving that's part of a 6-panel mythological cycle involving a sky goddess, a solar bark, and a baboon holding knives. The simpler version travels further, even though the more complicated version is the one that's actually documented in the academic literature. And part of it is a real, human reaction that's worth taking seriously rather than mocking. People look at the ancient world and reasonably wonder what we've lost track of. Egyptian engineering, the pyramids, the precision stonework, the astronomical alignments in temple construction, really is impressive enough that maybe they knew more than we give them credit for doesn't sound absurd on its face. The problem isn't the impulse to wonder. It's that this particular carving has a well-documented, specific answer already sitting right next to it in the hieroglyphic text, and that answer gets skipped over almost every time the image gets shared. It helps to lay the two interpretations next to each other directly, because doing so makes clear how lopsided the actual evidence is. The religious reading is supported by a named deity, Horus Simatoi, who is independently documented across other Dendera and Edfu reliefs going back to at least a late period, long before the specific set of carvings was made. It's supported by a translated inscription that explicitly describes a sunrise myth, by companion imagery, a solar bark, a sky goddess, that only makes narrative sense as part of a mythological cycle, and by the presence of figures, a kneeling worshiper, a baboon with knives, that have clear ritual meaning elsewhere in Egyptian art, but no coherent role in an electrical device story. It also fits into a temple building program that we know, from a huge and independently verified body of inscriptions, was preoccupied with solar theology, divine birth, and the cycle of day and night at every level of its decoration. The electrical reading rests on the visual shape of a single isolated panel resembling a 19th century invention on a working replica that shows the shape is compatible with functioning as a lamp. Not that it was built or used as one, and on the assumption that a restricted crypt implies hidden technology rather than simply restricted religious material, which was true of a great deal of Egyptian temple content that had nothing to do with engineering. It doesn't have a supporting mythological figure, a supporting inscription, or supporting archaeological evidence of a wider lighting infrastructure anywhere in Egypt from this period. That asymmetry is really the whole story. One interpretation is built from converging, independently attested evidence spanning inscriptions, iconography, and comparative material from a neighboring temple. The other is built from the outline of one panel, and the fact that outlines can resemble things. Strip away the modern framing, and what's left at Dendera is still a remarkable piece of art, just not for the reasons the light bulb theory suggests. It's a carefully constructed piece of solar mythology, executed with enough consistency across multiple panels at two separate temples that Egyptologists can track how the god Horus Simatoi moves through an entire visual narrative, born from a lotus inside the body of the sky, then shown a scene later riding the sun's own boat across the heavens. That a religious system with real depth and real internal logic, built by people who were extremely good at encoding complex theological ideas into compact, repeatable visual language. Good enough, in fact, that a piece of their religious art can still get mistaken for an engineering diagram 23 centuries later. That's arguably the more interesting story. Not that the ancient Egyptians secretly had electricity and hid it in a temple basement, but that they built symbolic systems precise and consistent enough to fool modern eyes trained on entirely different technology without ever intending to. The resemblance to a light bulb isn't a code waiting to be cracked. It's a coincidence of shape between two things, a religious birth of the sun scene and a 19th century lighting invention that happen to share a simple geometric outline for completely unrelated reasons. The real history here doesn't need an electrical mystery to be worth telling. It's a solar myth carved in stone by people who never once needed a light bulb to explain where the sun came from every morning. Already worked that out for themselves, in their own language, thousands of years before anyone invented the filament. If you want to go looking at this yourself, search for Dendera Crypt Reliefs Waitkiss or Horasimatoi Edfi Dendera. The published translations are out there, and reading the actual inscriptions next to the image is a much better way to settle the question than a side-by-side photo comparison ever will be.